I am a woman in my late 20s. While finishing up my degree and working part-time, I had to find a new place to stay because my parents decided to downsize their home. It made sense for me to move in with my older brother, Grant. He had a stable job, a house big enough, and he told me straight up that he was glad to have me there. His wife, Sophie, often traveled for work, so he liked the idea of having some company around the place. When I moved in, I made sure I pulled my weight. I paid rent every month on time, I bought groceries, and I cleaned up. Grant would tell me he appreciated the help, especially when things got busy at his job. For a while, it felt like it was working out, but the shift happened quickly once Sophie came home from one of her trips. Sophie introduced what she called house rules. She printed them out and stuck them on the fridge. Things like a strict cleaning rotation, who used the laundry on what days, even how late the dishwasher could be run. She also added limits on how often I could have people over, even though I barely had friends visiting anyway. It rubbed me the wrong way, but I didn't argue. I thought maybe she just liked structure, so I went along with it to avoid problems. When Grant was around, Sophie acted perfectly polite. She'd ask me how school was, smile during dinner, play the part of the good sister-in-law. The second we were alone, her tone shifted. She became short, dismissive, and sometimes didn't even answer when I spoke to her. Small things kept happening too. I'd leave my toiletries in the bathroom cabinet and they'd be moved into a plastic bag outside my room. I'd put food in the fridge and it would get shoved to the back or left out on the counter. At first I thought I was being sensitive, but it started adding up. I mentioned it to Grant once and he brushed it off. He told me Sophie was just adjusting to sharing her space and that it wasn't personal. I wanted to believe him, but it was hard when the signs were right in front of me. Sophie never once acknowledged anything I contributed to the house. She would brag to Grant about keeping things running smoothly when I was the one cleaning or restocking the pantry. I'd hear her telling him she did all the grocery shopping, when half the bags in the kitchen had been mine. When relatives came over, Sophie would introduce me in a way that made it sound temporary. "This is Alyssa, she's just staying here for a little while," as if I hadn't been paying rent and pulling my share. She'd make little jokes too, calling me the permanent roommate or saying Grant had his own dependent now. People laughed awkwardly, but I could feel the dig. It didn't stop there. One night I overheard Sophie telling Grant that since they might want kids one day, it would make sense for me to pay more rent. She said my room could eventually be the nursery, so my share should be higher to reflect the space. It wasn't even subtle anymore. I tried to talk to Grant about it, but he got defensive. He said he had to put his marriage first, but he also told me he still wanted me there. It felt like he was caught in the middle, but instead of addressing the problem, he was dodging it. The nitpicking started next. I plugged in my laptop charger in the living room while I studied, and Sophie accused me of driving up the electricity bill. She said it in a tone that made it sound like I was freeloading, even though my rent covered utilities. Piece by piece, it became clear what was going on. Sophie was manufacturing reasons to paint me as a burden. Every rule, every joke, every nitpick was building a case against me. I wasn't imagining it anymore. The pattern was too obvious. I started keeping mental notes, not just about what she said or did, but how Grant responded, who was around to witness it, and what things seemed to line up. It wasn't just about surviving under her roof anymore. Something told me Sophie was maneuvering toward a bigger move, and I needed to be ready for it. What made it harder was that I liked living with Grant. He and I had always been close, and for the first time in years, I felt like we were back under one roof again. But with Sophie tightening her grip, I knew it wasn't going to last. Something was coming, and I could already feel her pushing me toward the door. That was the beginning, before everything spun into the mess that followed. At first, it was just rules on the fridge and little jokes at family dinners. But those small things built into a pattern that I couldn't ignore, and it was only the start of what Sophie had planned. I am a woman in my late 20s, and after moving into my brother Grant's house, things with his wife Sophie started getting more and more tense. At first, it was just little digs and controlling rules. But as time went on, Sophie started turning up the pressure. The first big clash happened in the kitchen. I was cooking a simple meal on a night Sophie got home later than usual. Grant was in the living room, relaxed after work. When Sophie came in, she looked around at the counters, the cutting board, the pans, and immediately pointed out how much space I was taking. She told Grant later that she couldn't even make a snack because I took over. From then on, whenever I made dinner, she would hover or criticize the way I left utensils to dry. It became clear she wanted the kitchen to feel like hers only. Groceries became the next battleground. Sophie started labeling items in the fridge with sticky notes. Her milk, her yogurt, her bread. Even though half the groceries were things I bought with my own money, she made it seem like I had no right to touch anything. The one time I used her butter by accident, she made a scene about how I never respected boundaries. After that, I noticed her starting to eat some of my things. And when I asked where they went, she brushed it off as a mistake. It wasn't just food. Grant began repeating Sophie's complaints to me, even though he never saw them himself. He told me I should be more considerate with how much space I used, or how I scheduled laundry. He wasn't angry, but he was echoing her words almost word for word. I realized she was feeding him a steady stream of small grievances, and he was absorbing them without question. One night, Grant invited friends over for dinner. I joined them at the table, and Sophie made a pointed comment that I needed to learn independence. The room went quiet. Everyone knew I was in school and working. One of Grant's friends asked me about my degree to break the tension, but Sophie circled back later with another joke about me still being in the nest. It was clear she wanted me embarrassed in front of people. I tried confronting her once in private. I asked her directly what the problem was, why she was acting like I was intruding when I paid my share. She gave me a vague answer about siblings not needing to rely on each other forever. She didn't actually address anything, and instead acted like I was imagining the hostility. Not long after, Sophie began telling Grant I wasn't pulling my weight. She told him I was lazy, even though my schedule was packed between work and school. She claimed I left chores unfinished, when I had been the one keeping up with most of them. Grant didn't fully believe it, but I could tell it was planting doubt. She also started cutting me out of plans. Sophie organized a group outing with some mutual friends. I found out later only because Grant mentioned it in passing. When I asked, Sophie acted like she forgot to tell me. It happened more than once, and I started noticing that anytime there was a social event, Sophie quietly left me out of the loop. Finances became another weapon. Sophie suggested I should help with their car insurance, since I benefited when Grant drove us places. The thing was, I had my own car and paid all my own expenses. The suggestion made no sense, but she kept pressing the idea to Grant when I wasn't around. One day I noticed my laundry detergent was gone. I looked everywhere in the laundry room, and eventually found the half-empty bottle sitting in Sophie's bathroom. When I mentioned it, she acted confused, like it must have been a mix-up. After that, I started keeping my supplies in my own room. Grant began to pull back around this time. He wasn't openly siding against me, but he stopped engaging when conflicts came up. He started staying out of the room when Sophie picked at me, pretending he didn't notice. It was his way of avoiding taking sides, but it made things worse. The holidays made the tension public. At a family dinner, Sophie arranged the seating and placed me at a side table with kids instead of at the main one with Grant and the adults. When someone pointed out that I should sit with my brother, Sophie laughed and said it was fine. I'd be more comfortable there. Relatives exchanged looks, but no one called her out directly. I sat through it quietly, but it was humiliating. People noticed, and I could see the discomfort in their faces. Sophie had a way of making digs that seemed lighthearted but carried sharp edges. At home afterward, Sophie kept pressing Grant that my presence was holding them back. She told him outright that they couldn't start a family while I was in the house. It was no longer subtle. She wanted me gone. That week, I caught Sophie boxing up some of my things in the storage room. When I asked about it, she said she was just organizing. But the boxes were labeled with my name, and it was obvious she was preparing for me to leave. Even the Wi-Fi became a point of control. One night I couldn't connect, and when I asked Grant, he said Sophie changed the password. She told him it was for security reasons, but she never gave me the new one. I ended up using my phone data for school assignments. The final push came late one night, when Sophie cornered Grant in the kitchen, within earshot. She told him this arrangement couldn't last much longer. She said if he wanted to move forward with her, he needed to make a decision. From that moment, I knew what was coming. It wasn't a matter of if, it was a matter of when. Sophie had been setting the stage for months, building her case piece by piece. Now she was pressing for the final move. I didn't pack up right away, but I could feel it closing in. Every small act, every missing item, every humiliating comment was pointing in one direction. Sophie wanted me out, and she wasn't hiding it anymore. That was the turning point where the tension stopped being small things around the house and became open pressure. I could sense the eviction coming, and Sophie made sure I could feel it every single day. One weekend, Grant asked me to sit down in the living room. Sophie was already there, sitting right beside him on the couch, her hand resting on his knee like she was steering the whole moment. The air felt rehearsed. I didn't even need to hear the words to know what was coming. Grant started carefully, saying we needed to discuss the living arrangements. He avoided looking at me too long, glancing at Sophie like he was waiting for her approval before continuing. He explained that Sophie had been feeling uncomfortable with how things were, that she thought the house wasn't functioning as it should with me living there. He said they needed more privacy as a couple. Sophie added in her practiced voice that she had nothing against me, but they were at a point where they had to think about their future. My room, according to her, would eventually be needed for other plans. She made a vague reference to family planning, even though Grant had admitted to me more than once that they weren't even thinking about kids yet. I pointed out how I paid rent every month without fail, bought groceries, and handled a fair share of chores. Grant knew it was true, but he looked down at his hands and avoided meeting my eyes. Sophie gave a little performance, clutching at her chest and insisting it hurt her to even bring this up. She said she wanted me to know she respected me, but it was time for me to be on my own. Finally, Grant gave the verdict. He said I had 1 month to find a new place. He framed it like it wasn't personal, like it was simply the next step, but the words still landed heavy. After that, Sophie barely acknowledged me. She would walk past me in the hall without a glance, like I was already out the door. When we were in the kitchen at the same time, she moved silently, making it clear she was erasing me before I even left. Within a week, I found some of my belongings already packed into boxes in the garage. I hadn't touched them. Sophie had gone into my room and boxed things herself. My clothes were folded into the wrong piles, my books stacked haphazardly, like she just wanted them out of sight. When I asked Grant about it, he shrugged and said maybe Sophie was trying to help me get started. The Wi-Fi became her final petty move. I tried logging on one night to finish a project for school, only to find the network locked again. When I asked Grant, he admitted Sophie had changed the password for security reasons. She never gave me the new one, so I ended up using my phone data to get through my assignments. I couldn't keep it to myself, so I went to our parents. They were stunned when I told them. My mother's face dropped, and my father shook his head in disbelief. They both said this wasn't like Grant, that Sophie had too much sway over him. They were disappointed but not surprised, since they had noticed her controlling streak during family dinners. As the weeks went by, I realized I had a choice. I could pack up quietly and let Sophie tell whatever story she wanted about me, or I could make sure the truth didn't get lost. I thought about all the little things she had done. The groceries, the stolen detergent, the fake friendliness in public, the digs in private, the way she boxed up my belongings before I even agreed to leave. It was a pattern too deliberate to ignore, so instead of leaving in shame, I decided I would leave with strategy. I started organizing my notes, recalling each manipulative thing Sophie had pulled since the day I moved in. I went back through texts, bank transfers, and receipts. I replayed family dinners in my head, remembering who had been there to witness her digs and how she tried to twist conversations. Every detail became part of the record I was building, even if only for myself at that point. When the final week of my deadline came, I packed my things myself. Sophie watched from the hallway without speaking, her arms crossed. She didn't lift a finger to help, and when I carried the last box to my car, she turned and walked away like it was already finished. I drove off with my boxes, but it wasn't the end for me. Sophie thought she had won by pushing me out, but all she had done was give me the distance and clarity to prepare for what came next. I wasn't going to just fade from the story. If Sophie wanted me gone, fine. But I was going to make sure the way she did it didn't disappear into her version of events. That move out marked the start of my plan. I wasn't going to fight her directly in her house anymore. I was going to wait, watch, and gather proof until the cracks in her performance showed themselves to everyone else. Sophie thought she boxed me up like one of my belongings, but she had no idea I was about to turn the tables. After leaving Grant's house, I moved into a modest apartment with a college friend. It wasn't fancy, just 2 small bedrooms, a narrow kitchen, and a living room with thrift store furniture, but it felt like freedom compared to the constant tension I'd left behind. The silence was different here. No rules taped to the fridge, no belongings mysteriously moved, no cold stares in the hallway. Even so, the sting of being pushed out by my own brother's wife still hung in the background. Not long after I settled in, my parents invited both Grant and me over for Sunday dinner. They had been trying to keep family traditions steady despite the rift. Sophie apparently tried to talk Grant out of going, but he came anyway, which told me something about how hard she was pressing. When we all sat down at the table, Sophie turned on her performance mode. She smiled wide, complimented the food, and even asked me questions in a sugary tone, like nothing bad had ever happened between us. It was such a sharp contrast from the way she'd acted behind closed doors that it almost caught me off guard. But her mask didn't last long. I caught her in the corner of the dining room whispering to one of our aunts. She claimed I had refused to pay rent while living with them, that I had been a burden, and left them struggling financially. I stood right there, pulled up my phone, and showed our aunt the records. Every bank transfer, every payment logged clearly in my history. Grant froze when he saw it. He looked at me, then at Sophie, then back at the screen. It was the first time I noticed him at a loss for words. Sophie quickly called it a misunderstanding, brushing it off like it wasn't a big deal, but her tight jaw gave her away. She hadn't expected me to have proof ready. That night I noticed something else. Sophie was wearing our grandmother's bracelet, a silver piece with a small engraving inside. It was the kind of thing that had sentimental weight in the family. I remembered leaving it behind in the rush of moving out, tucked safely in my dresser drawer. Seeing it on Sophie's wrist made my stomach turn. Later, when I quietly asked Grant about it, he looked confused. He said Sophie told him it was hers, something she'd had for years. I reminded him where it came from, how our grandmother gave it to me after my high school graduation. The expression on his face shifted, just slightly, but enough to show he was questioning her story. That was the first crack. It wasn't huge, but it was there. The following week, at another gathering, I overheard Sophie on the phone in the hallway. She was laughing and bragging to someone about how she had finally gotten rid of the tag-along. She made it sound like she had outsmarted me, like pushing me out had been some kind of accomplishment. She didn't realize I was close enough to hear every word. Not long after, one of my cousins pulled me aside. He told me Sophie had been spreading lies about me for months, claiming I never helped, that I left messes, that I used Grant's money instead of my own. He admitted he hadn't believed her, but he wanted me to know what was being said. It confirmed that her smear campaign wasn't just inside the house, it was aimed at the whole family. Instead of blowing up, I decided to keep calm. Every inconsistency, every lie, every brag she slipped up with, I was going to gather it all. Let her keep digging her own hole, while I quietly built the record. At the next family dinner, Sophie slipped again. She made a joke about me still being in school and dragging out my degree. What she didn't know was that I had already graduated. My parents immediately corrected her, and the room went quiet. Relatives looked at her with raised eyebrows, realizing she was speaking without facts. Grant's face shifted again, the second time I caught him visibly noticing her pettiness. The bracelet, the rent lie, the overheard phone call, the smear stories, and now the false comment about my education. It was a trail of contradictions stacking higher and higher. From that point, I started documenting. I wrote down dates, conversations, names of people who overheard, even screenshots when I could. I wasn't going to confront her blindly and get twisted into another story. I wanted undeniable proof when the moment came. By then, Sophie thought she had won. In reality, the cracks were already spreading, and I was preparing to let the whole mask fall apart. This was the stage where things shifted. I wasn't just on the defensive anymore. I had started moving carefully, watching for every slip she made, and she was slipping more often than ever. She thought pushing me out was the end. What she didn't realize was that it was only the beginning of me exposing her for exactly who she was. A mutual friend reached out one evening with something I hadn't expected to hear. She told me Sophie had been openly saying she wanted Grant to distance himself from his family. Not just me, everyone. She had apparently told a small group that Grant would be better off without the constant pull of relatives, and that she wanted him fully on her side, with no outside influence. That piece of information connected everything I had noticed. It was never just about pushing me out of the house. Sophie's plan was bigger. She wanted Grant cut off from everyone, isolated so she could control the entire picture. I sat down with my parents later that week and told them what I had learned. They weren't surprised. They admitted Sophie had been making excuses to skip family events, claiming Grant was too tired, or that they had prior plans. My parents had noticed the pattern but didn't realize how deliberate it was until I laid it all out. Around this same time, a cousin helped me uncover something that made the situation even more serious. He worked in finance and had access to certain tools that let him notice irregularities. He discovered that Sophie had been moving money from the joint account she shared with Grant into her personal account. The transfers were disguised as small household expenses, but the money was going toward things like online shopping and salon treatments. Grant hadn't been told. I gathered the proof, bank statements, receipts, screenshots, and held on to them. It was one thing to deal with her lies about me, but taking money without Grant's knowledge crossed a whole new line. The next family dinner gave me the chance to show Grant. We were sitting around after the meal when I brought out the documents. I placed them in front of him and pointed to the repeated transfers. For the first time, I saw genuine shock on his face. He kept glancing at the pages, flipping through them, trying to make sense of it. Sophie jumped in immediately. She accused me of digging for dirt, of trying to ruin her marriage. She waved it off like it was exaggerated, but the numbers were right there in black and white. Grant didn't argue, but I could see him struggling. Then came her slip-up. In her frustration, Sophie blurted out that she had boxed up my things early on purpose to make me leave faster. The room went silent. Everyone knew she had always denied doing that. My mother, who had been standing nearby, finally lost patience. She looked straight at Sophie and called her manipulative. Sophie's face turned red. She stood up, grabbed her purse, and stormed out of the house. Before leaving, she threw down one last statement. She wouldn't come back unless Grant chose her fully. She wanted him to pick between her and the family right then and there. Grant didn't follow her out the door. He sat back down, pale, visibly shaken. He didn't say much, but the conflict was written all over him. He had spent months defending Sophie, but now the cracks were too big to ignore. While things were quiet, I showed him the receipts I had kept from my time living with them. Every rent payment, every utility contribution, every grocery run, it was all documented. It directly contradicted everything Sophie had claimed about me not paying my way. Relatives began chiming in, telling Grant they had noticed Sophie's behavior too. One uncle mentioned how she always redirected conversations to make herself look like the center. A cousin talked about how she whispered negative things about me at gatherings. Piece by piece, the family built the case right in front of him. Sophie tried to regain control later by calling around and telling people I was envious of her marriage, that I had been trying to drive a wedge between them. But this time, nobody bought it. The family had already seen enough with their own eyes. The charm act had worn thin. That dinner became the turning point. Grant hadn't made his decision yet, but his loyalty was no longer automatic. He was stuck between what Sophie had always told him and the evidence piling up from everyone else. The mask Sophie had worn for so long was cracked wide open, and the people around us finally saw the truth she had worked so hard to hide. For the first time, Sophie didn't have full control of the story. After Sophie stormed out of that family dinner, things between her and Grant didn't return to normal. She stayed away for a couple of nights, and when she finally came back, she was wearing the bracelet again, the one that had belonged to our grandmother. That piece had become a quiet symbol of the lies she had been building, and Grant couldn't ignore it anymore. At home, he finally asked her about it directly. Instead of giving a calm explanation, Sophie snapped. She said it had been left behind, so it was hers now. She claimed it was fair game because I hadn't taken it with me when I left. Grant didn't buy it. That was the first time he pushed back against her story instead of just accepting it. While sorting through storage boxes in the garage, Grant found more of my belongings hidden away. Items Sophie had quietly moved without telling me. Small things I hadn't been able to pack in the rush. An old journal, a necklace, even a sweater. None of it had any reason to be in her space. When he confronted her, Sophie lashed out, accusing me of planting them there to frame her. The excuse made no sense, and Grant could see through it. The tension built quickly from there. Grant confronted her about the money transfers I had exposed at the dinner. Sophie tried to spin it into an argument about how she deserved extra spending money for keeping the house together. She framed it as her right, but Grant pointed out that she had kept it secret, hidden from him. The contrast between my receipts and her excuses was too sharp to ignore. The argument escalated into shouting. Sophie accused me of poisoning him against her. She paced around the living room, voice rising, pointing at every small flaw she could name. Grant stayed firm this time. He told her that respect for his family was not negotiable, and if she couldn't show it, she needed to seriously rethink how she treated the people closest to him. That ultimatum sent her into a meltdown. Sophie stormed out, slamming the door, and went to stay with a friend. For once, Grant didn't chase after her. He sat with the silence, the weight of everything he had ignored for so long pressing down on him. I stayed quiet, letting him process. Later, he admitted he had ignored too many red flags because he wanted to believe the best. He told me it was only now, with the lies stacked high and visible to everyone, that he realized how deep Sophie's control had run. Our parents and cousins began showing their support for him, making it clear he wasn't imagining things. They had seen Sophie's manipulation firsthand, from the boxed-up belongings to the controlling way she isolated him. Every piece of evidence, every contradiction, was reinforcing what I had been saying for months. Sophie, meanwhile, tried her old tactics again. She contacted relatives individually, claiming Grant was being controlled by me now, that he wasn't thinking for himself. But this time, it didn't stick. The family dismissed her story. They had already seen enough to know the truth. Grant told me quietly one evening that he saw everything differently now. He said Sophie's behavior had never been about sharing space with me. It was about cutting him off from his family completely. He reflected on how isolated he had become, how every decision he made had been filtered through her approval. For me, the difference was clear too. Because I had kept calm and stuck to facts instead of yelling or trading insults, my side of the story held up. Grant admitted that if I had lost control, Sophie might have spun it into another weapon. But by keeping proof, I had left no room for her to twist it. Even then, Grant didn't move straight into ending things. He started preparing quietly, making sure he had control of his finances, securing important documents, and talking to trusted relatives. He was cautious, careful, aware that Sophie would not leave without a fight. The cracks in their marriage were too wide to cover anymore. The bracelet lie, the stolen belongings, the secret transfers, the family dinner outburst, it all added up. Sophie could no longer charm her way out of the truth. Grant hadn't filed for separation yet, but the steps were already in motion, and everyone who had watched the situation unfold knew that the storm Sophie had created was finally circling back on her. This was the breaking point. Sophie had pushed too far, and for the first time, Grant wasn't standing by her side. He was standing on his own, with his family watching closely. And I knew, just from the way Sophie had exploded that night, that she wasn't done. She had lost control of the story, and people like Sophie don't walk away quietly. Grant didn't wait long after Sophie's meltdown to make his decision. He had already gathered enough proof, heard enough contradictions, and seen enough of her manipulations. What had once been excuses he brushed off had become undeniable patterns. By the time Sophie returned to the house after her outburst, Grant had already moved his personal documents, secured his finances, and prepared himself for the conversation he knew had to happen. He asked her to sit down in the living room. No family this time, no audience, no distractions, just the two of them. He laid it out plainly. The marriage was over. He cited everything that had built up. The lies about me, the secret money transfers, the manipulation, the stolen belongings, the deliberate attempts to isolate him from everyone who cared about him. Sophie immediately launched into her old routine, insisting that I had poisoned him against her, that his family was trying to tear them apart. Grant stopped her cold. He told her his decision wasn't based on anything I said, but on her own actions, the things she had done, and the lies she had told that he could no longer ignore. For the first time, Grant didn't ask her for explanations or give her space to argue. He told her directly it wasn't up for debate. He had already made up his mind. Sophie tried another angle, saying that boxing up my belongings was justified, that she had only been doing what needed to be done. Grant didn't let her spin it. He reminded her that going into my room, taking my things, and keeping family heirlooms like the bracelet was a violation that couldn't be excused. He gave her a deadline. She had 1 week to collect her belongings and move out. If she didn't, he would arrange to have her things removed himself. The explosion came next. Sophie screamed, slammed doors, threw accusations in every direction. She told him he was abandoning his wife for outsiders. Grant stayed calm and replied that she had made herself the outsider by trying to cut him off from everyone who cared about him. She stormed out again, this time slamming the door hard enough to rattle the frames on the wall. But unlike before, Grant didn't wait or hope she would come back calmer. He didn't chase her. He didn't call. He sat with his decision and let it stand. That evening, he called me. He told me directly what had happened, every word of it, every reaction she had thrown at him. He admitted how blind he had been, how much of her behavior he had excused. He told me he finally saw the pattern in full. The next week was quiet. Sophie came back only once, and it was to pack clothes into suitcases while avoiding eye contact with anyone. She moved quickly, furious but silent, carrying bags to her car without speaking to Grant or leaving a note behind. Grant didn't hide what was happening. At the next family dinner, he showed up alone. The shift in the room was immediate. No one gloated, no one rubbed it in, but the quiet relief was obvious. People spoke to him warmly, asked him about work, included him in conversations. It was the first time in months he hadn't been shadowed by Sophie's controlling presence. Over the following weeks, Grant took steps to reset his life. He spent more time at our parents' house, reconnected with cousins, and picked up old traditions Sophie had discouraged. He started to manage his finances independently again, double-checking his accounts to make sure no other hidden transfers had slipped past him. Sophie, meanwhile, tried one last time to control the story. She reached out to distant relatives, telling them Grant had been manipulated by me, that I had always been jealous of her, that the family turned him against her unfairly. But this time, nobody bought it. Too much had already been revealed. The bracelet, the rent lies, the bank transfers, the family outbursts, her actions spoke louder than her words. Within a month, Grant filed for legal separation. Sophie didn't take it well, but she didn't have much left to stand on. Her reputation in the family had crumbled, her stories no longer held weight, and the mask she wore for years had finally shattered. For me, the moment of closure came when Grant and I sat down together in the kitchen of our parents' house. We had coffee, just the two of us, without tension, without whispers in the background. For the first time since I moved in with him, it was quiet. No digs, no manipulation, no third voice steering the conversation. Grant told me he was moving forward, that he wouldn't let himself get trapped again. He acknowledged how Sophie had turned what should have been a supportive arrangement into a weapon, and how it nearly cost him his relationship with his family. I didn't have to say much. The outcome spoke for itself. Sophie had once boxed up my belongings to push me out of their house, but in the end she was the one packing bags and carrying them out the door. The irony wasn't lost on anyone. Sophie thought she had won when I drove away months earlier. She thought she erased me from the picture, rewritten as the dependent sister she forced out. But her plan backfired. She lost the very thing she thought she controlled, her place in Grant's life. And that was the final chapter of her grip on our family.